The Arizona sun has a way of baking secrets into the dirt. It turns whispers of greed and murder into the silence of the landscape itself. Out on the edge of the territories, a man can ride for 3 days and see nothing but the ghosts of what used to be and the buzzards of what's to come. This is the story of a man who thought his life was already over. A lonely rancher named Kais Monroe. He was a man hollowed out by grief, tending to the scars on his land and the deeper ones on his soul. But one blistering afternoon in 1878, he found a secret that refused to stay buried. A secret hanging from the branch of a dead mesquite tree with a message meant to start a war. And that message was a lie. Kais Monroe's ranch wasn't a home. It was a monument to absence. The two-room cabin, built with his own hands from sturdy pine, sat defiant against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the San Simon Valley. Every floorboard his late wife Sarah had swept, every nail he'd hammered, echoed with a silence that was louder than any storm. She'd been gone 5 years. A fever had swept through their valley like a brush fire, taking their newborn son with her. Since then, Kais's world had shrunk to the boundaries of his property line, a sprawling but lonely kingdom of dust, cattle, and memories that bit like horseflies. His days were a ritual, a penance he paid to the sun. He rose before dawn, the chill of the high desert air a familiar slap. He'd make coffee, black and bitter, and stand on his porch watching the sky bleed from purple to orange over the Chiricahua Mountains. Those mountains were Apache land, a place of legends and a source of deep unease for the settlers pushing west. For Kais, they were just a backdrop, a jagged line on the horizon that mirrored the fractured line of his own life. On this particular Thursday, the heat was a physical weight. The air shimmered above the baked earth, and the cattle huddled listlessly in the thin shade of the cottonwoods by the creek. A storm the night before had knocked down a section of his northern fence line, the one that bordered the rough, unclaimed territory that bled into the foothills. It was a chore he didn't relish. But the fence was the only thing standing between his herd and the open range. Or worse, the rustlers who preyed on isolated ranches just like his. He saddled his horse, Dust Devil, a wiry buckskin gelding as cantankerous and resilient as Kais himself. He didn't bother with a rifle. The Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip had been a constant companion for years, its weight a familiar comfort. He rode north, the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather the only sound besides the buzzing of insects. He found the break easily enough. A heavy branch, struck by lightning, had crashed down, snapping 3 posts and tangling the wire. Kais dismounted, grabbing the tools from his saddlebag. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements economical, his face set in the permanent, sun-creased squint of a man who spent more time looking at horizons than at other people. But it was the birds that alerted him first. Not the usual squawking of crows, but a dead, watchful silence. The air grew still, heavy. Kais paused, his hand on a new post, and scanned the area. His gaze drifted past the broken fence, towards a gnarled, skeletal mesquite tree that stood alone about 50 yards away. Something was wrong. Something was hanging from one of its thickest branches. At first, he thought it was a deer carcass, maybe left by a mountain lion. But the shape was too small, the color too bright. It was a splash of vibrant blue and red against the muted brown of the desert. He dropped his tools. His heart began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. He approached the tree slowly, Dust Devil snorting nervously behind him. The closer he got, the more the shape resolved itself into a horrifying tableau. It was a child, a girl by the look of the beaded deerskin dress. Her small body was limp, swaying almost imperceptibly in the faint breeze. Her black hair, long and straight, partially obscured her face. Kais's breath hitched. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him, chasing away the desert heat. He'd seen death in many forms. In the war, in bar brawls, in the unforgiving grip of sickness. But this was different. This was a desecration. As he got closer, he saw the sign. A rough plank piece of wood nailed to the trunk of the tree just below the branch. The letters were painted in stark white, crude and dripping. It looked like lard. White man, don't forgive. The words were a punch to the gut. It was a threat, a declaration. It was meant to be found, meant to send a message. But what message, and to whom? Was this retaliation for some settler's crime? Or a warning? His eyes moved back to the girl. She looked to be Apache, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Her feet were bare, her moccasins gone. A thick rope was knotted cruelly around her neck. Kais's stomach churned. For a moment, the memory of his wife's still face, in the tiny cold bundle in her arms, threatened to buckle his knees. He fought it down, replacing the grief with a surge of cold, hard rage. Who could do this? Who could lynch a child and leave her as a grotesque signpost? The anger gave him purpose. He couldn't leave her here for the buzzards. It was an affront to God and man alike. He holstered his Colt and approached the trunk, intending to cut her down and give her a proper burial back at his ranch. He reached up, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he touched the rope to find a place to cut. And then his world stopped. Beneath his fingers, against the taut rope, he felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, almost imperceptible. But it was there. A tiny, stubborn flutter of life in the midst of this calculated display of death. He stared in disbelief. She was alive, barely hanging by a thread thinner than the rope around her neck, but alive. The carefully constructed horror scene was not a final act, but an ongoing one. They had left her to die slowly, to be found this way. In that instant, Kais Monroe's lonely, quiet world shattered. He was no longer a grieving widower tending his fences. He was the sole witness to an atrocity, and the life of this Apache girl was now, quite literally, in his hands. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to ride away. The sign was clear. Helping her would be seen as defiance. It would bring whoever did this down on his head. They would not be kind. He looked at the girl's small, still form, then back at the jagged peaks of the Chiricahuas. He thought of Sarah, of the quiet strength she possessed, of how she would have looked at him with contempt if he turned his back now. The silence of his life had been a choice, a retreat. But this silence, the silence of complicity, was one he could not bear. With a curse that was half prayer, he drew his knife. He wasn't just cutting a rope. He was cutting ties with his self-imposed exile and stepping into a conflict far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The blade sliced through the hemp, and the small body fell into his waiting arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and spirit. As he held her, her eyelids fluttered open for a second, revealing dark, terrified eyes that saw him, truly saw him, before rolling back into unconsciousness. Kais held her close, his rage now forged into a steely resolve. He would not let her die, and he would find the men who did this. The sign said, "White men don't forgive." Kais Monroe was about to prove them right. Carrying the child was like holding a bird with a broken wing. Kais cradled her against his chest as he urged Dust Devil into a steady, ground-eating trot back to the cabin. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of guilt and fear through him. Guilt that he hadn't found her sooner. Fear of what would happen when her attackers discovered their grim message had been ignored. He laid her gently on his own bed, the one Sarah had died in. The irony was a bitter pill. For 5 years, the bed had been a shrine of sorrow. Now it was a cot in a field hospital. He worked with a frantic urgency he hadn't felt in years. He cut the rest of the rope away, his fingers fumbling with the knot. The rope had dug deep into her flesh, leaving a horrifying raw ligature mark around her slender neck. He cleaned the wound as best he could with whiskey and a clean rag, his touch surprisingly deft for a man whose hands were more used to branding irons and axe handles. She was severely dehydrated, her lips cracked and her skin papery. He dribbled water from a spoon between her lips, a few drops at a time. Most of it ran down her chin, but some of it went down. It was a start. For hours he sat by her side, a silent vigil, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. In her unconscious state, she looked even younger, her face smooth and free of the terror he'd seen in that brief moment of awareness. She wore a simple dress of deep blue cloth, decorated with intricate red and yellow beadwork and patterns he didn't recognize. It was the dress of a beloved child, not a nameless vagrant. As night fell, a fever took hold. She began to murmur in a language he didn't understand, her small body thrashing against his sheets. Kais bathed her forehead with cool water, his big frame hunched over her small one. In the flickering lamplight, he was no longer just a rancher. He was a nurse, a guardian. The emptiness of the cabin was gone, replaced by the tense, fragile presence of another life. He found himself talking to her, his voice a low rumble, the way he used to talk to his nervous cattle. "Easy now, little one. You're safe here. Just hold on." He didn't know if she could hear him, or if she would even understand his words if she could. But the sound of a human voice, steady and calm, seemed to soothe her restless spirit. The ghosts of Sarah and his son felt less like accusers and more like quiet observers in the corners of the room. He was doing what he couldn't do for them. He was fighting. For 2 days she drifted in and out of consciousness. He fed her thin broth and more water, and slowly the fever began to break. On the third morning, he walked into the bedroom to find her awake. She was sitting up, her back pressed against the headboard, her dark eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. When she saw him, she flinched so violently she almost fell off the bed. "Whoa, easy there," Kai said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." She scrambled to the far corner of the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. She said nothing, only watched him, her eyes tracking his every move like a cornered animal. The fear was a wall between them. Kais knew that words were useless. He backed out of the room slowly and returned a few minutes later with a bowl of stew, mostly broth, with a few soft-boiled potatoes and carrots. He placed it on a small crate by the door, well out of her reach. Then he retreated to his chair by the hearth, picked up a piece of leather he was mending, and pretended to ignore her. He could feel her eyes on him. For an hour, nothing happened. The silence was thick with suspicion. Then he heard a faint rustle. Peeking from the corner of his eye, he saw her inching towards the edge of the bed. Her movements were fluid and silent. She moved from the bed to the floor in a single motion, then crept toward the bowl. She snatched it, scurried back to her corner, and ate with a desperate hunger, scooping the stew with her fingers. It was the first victory. They fell into a routine. He would leave food and water for her. She would only take it when she thought he wasn't looking. She never spoke. Not a word. The only sounds she made were in her sleep, soft cries and whimpers that spoke of the horrors she had witnessed. Kais's rage simmered, a constant fire in his gut. He started sleeping with his rifle next to his cot in the main room. He checked the horizon constantly. He knew they would come. People who hang children don't leave loose ends. A week after he found her, she finally spoke. He was cleaning his rifle by the fire when he heard a small voice from the bedroom doorway. "Nalin." He looked up. She was standing there clutching the doorframe. She was still wary, but the stark terror had been replaced by a cautious curiosity. "What's that?" he asked gently. She pointed a small finger at her own chest. "Nalin." It was her name, a name for the spirit he'd been tending. He felt a lump form in his throat. "My name is Kais," he said, pointing to his own chest. She nodded slowly, testing the sound of his name on her tongue, though she didn't say it aloud. It was a bridge, a thin, rickety one, but a bridge nonetheless. Over the next few days, the bridge widened. She started to come out of the bedroom, perching on a stool by the fire, watching him work. They communicated in gestures and single words. He learned that her people lived toward the rising sun in the mountains. She learned the words for water, food, horse, and safe. That last one was the most important. He repeated it often, pointing to the cabin, to himself. Safe. One evening she showed him something. Using a charred stick from the fire, she began to draw on a spare piece of plank wood. She drew mountains. She drew a camp with several wickiups. She drew a man and a woman, her parents. Then she drew other men, white men. They weren't cowboys. She drew them with shiny circles on their chests, stars, and on their feet, she drew boots that were different, with fancy stitching. Then she drew fire, and she drew a stick figure of herself running. The last thing she drew was the tree. Kai stared at the crude drawing, his blood running cold. Stars on their chests, badges. The men who did this were lawmen, or posing as them. And the boots, fancy boots, weren't common among trail-worn deputies. They spoke of money, of authority. The drawing told a story he didn't want to understand. A raid, an official one, and it ended at that tree. But her drawing wasn't finished. She took the charred stick again and drew one more thing next to the men with stars. She drew a second group of men, white men, but different, dressed plainly, and she drew them fighting the men with the stars. Then she drew her parents giving the plain men something before the men with stars started shooting. What did it mean? It wasn't just a raid. It was a deal gone wrong, a bloody transaction, and Nalin had seen it all. The next afternoon, his fears were realized. He was chopping wood when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon, coming from the direction of town. It wasn't a lone rider. It was two. He squinted, his hand instinctively going to the Colt on his hip. He sent Nalin inside with a sharp, whispered command. Hide, now. She vanished without a sound. Kais had shown her a hiding place he'd built long ago for valuables. A small cellar beneath the floorboards hidden under a bearskin rug. He leaned the axe against the woodpile and waited, trying to look casual, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The riders slowed as they approached his cabin. They weren't deputies. They were hard-faced men with the dead-eyed look of hired guns. One was tall and thin, with a long duster despite the heat. The other was shorter, bull-necked, with a brutal-looking scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Howdy, the tall one said, his voice a dry rasp. He remained mounted, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from his pistol. This the Monroe Ranch? It is, Kais replied, his voice level. What can I do for you? Name's Wade, the tall one said, gesturing to his partner. This is Lyle. We're riding for Mr. Bartholomew Corian. I imagine you know the name. Kais knew it. Bart Corian was the biggest landowner in the county, a man who had gotten rich on cattle and rumors of silver, and who was known for getting what he wanted, one way or another. Corian's main ranch was 50 miles south, a veritable fortress. I know the name, Kai said. Mr. Corian lost some cattle. Wade continued, his eyes scanning the ranch, lingering on the cabin, the barn, the corral. They weren't looking for cattle. Thought they might have strayed up this way. You seen any unbranded yearlings? Haven't seen a thing, Kai said, his gaze unflinching. Lyle, the shorter man, spoke for the first time, his voice a low growl. Heard there was some trouble up this way, Apache trouble. Found a prospector, name of Peterson, dead about a week ago, not far from here. Him and his family, scalped. Kais's mind raced. Peterson. He'd heard the name. A stubborn old man who'd refused to sell his claim to Corian. Him and his family. Nalin's drawing flashed in his mind. The second group of white men. First I'm hearing of it, Kais lied. Wade's eyes narrowed. Funny. Seems like a man living out here all alone would be keen on news like that, especially when the savages get bold enough to leave warnings. He knew. He had to know. The question was a trap. I keep to myself, Kai said flatly. Don't have much use for town gossip. Wade smiled, a cold, predatory thing. A man who keeps to himself is a wise man. But sometimes things find you, whether you want them to or not. If you see anything unusual, Mr. Corian would be mighty grateful to know about it. He's offering a reward. The word unusual hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. They were talking about Nalin. The reward wasn't for information. It was for her. I'll keep an eye out, Kai said, the words tasting like ash. Wade held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded curtly. You do that. They turned their horses and rode away, but not back towards town. They rode along his fence line, heading north, towards the mesquite tree. Kais watched them go, his hand clenched into a fist. They weren't just searching. They were checking their work. They were making sure the body was still there, delivering its silent, terrifying message. When they were gone, Kais let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He went inside and pulled back the rug. He knocked twice. A few seconds later, the floorboards creaked and Nalin's head emerged. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, defiant light. She had heard everything. The pretense was over. They weren't just fugitives from an unknown threat anymore. The threat now had a name, Bartholomew Corian, and it was clear he would stop at nothing to cover his tracks and silence the last witness to his crime. Kais's small, lonely ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was the next battleground. The visit from Wade and Lyle settled in Kais's gut like a cold stone. He was no longer just hiding a child. He was standing against Bartholomew Corrigan, a man whose influence stretched across the territory like a shadow. His ranch, his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The vast open spaces that once offered solace now felt exposed, watched. He needed information, and he needed supplies. He couldn't risk being besieged without ammunition or flour. That meant a trip to Redemption Bluff. The town's name was a cruel joke. Founded by a fire and brimstone preacher decades ago, it had long since shed any semblance of grace. It was a dusty, hard-bitten supply town, clinging to the banks of a mostly dry river, serving the needs of ranchers, prospectors, and the less savory elements that drifted through the territory. Leaving Nalan was the hardest part. She understood the necessity, but fear clung to her like a second skin. "I will be back," he told her, kneeling to look her in the eyes. "Before the sun sets twice. You keep the door barred. Don't light a lamp after dark. Don't go outside for any reason. Understand?" She nodded, her small chin set with a stoicism that broke his heart. She handed him a small, intricately beaded pouch. "For luck," she whispered. It was one of the few things she'd managed to salvage from her old life. He tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket, the small gesture a heavier weight than all the gold in Corian's coffers. He rode hard, pushing Dust Devil, but keeping to the ravines and arroyos, avoiding the main trail. He felt 1,000 eyes on his back. Every hawk circling overhead seemed like a spy. It took him the better part of a day to reach the outskirts of town. He tethered his horse at the livery run by a wiry old hostler named Silas and walked into the heart of Redemption Bluff. The town was buzzing with a nervous energy. Men stood in tight groups outside the saloon and the general store, their voices low and angry. The words Apache, raid, and massacre drifted on the hot, dusty air. Corian's poison was working. Kais's first stop was the general store, a cluttered emporium run by a portly, sweating man named Finn. Kais bought beans, flour, coffee, and most importantly, 3 heavy boxes of 4440 cartridges for his Winchester and 45 rounds for his Colt. "Stocking up for a long winter, Kais?" Finn asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Or you heard the news?" "What news is that?" Kais asked, feigning ignorance. "The Petersons. Lord have mercy, Kais. The whole family. Found 'em up near the foothills. Savages did it. Sheriff Brody says it's the damn Chiricahua getting bold. Says they're probably planning a full-scale raid." Finn leaned closer. "The sheriff said that?" "As good as. He's forming a posse. Bartholomew Corrigan himself rode in this morning, put up $500 of his own money for the pacification of the territory. Says we got to hit 'em hard before they hit us." Kais's blood ran cold. Corrigan wasn't just covering his tracks. He was using the murders he committed to launch a land grab, using fear to fuel a private war that would clear the Apache from the land he coveted. And Sheriff Brody was his mouthpiece. He paid for his goods, his face an impassive mask. As he left the store, he saw Sheriff Brody himself standing on the steps of his office. Brody was a big man gone to seed, with a gut that strained the buttons of his vest. He had a loud voice and an easy smile, but his eyes were small and shifty. And on his feet, partially obscured by the dusty boardwalk, were a pair of expensive-looking boots with fancy, floral-patterned stitching. The same kind of boots Nalan had drawn. Kais felt a jolt, a sickening certainty. The sheriff was one of them. The star on his chest wasn't a symbol of the law. It was a costume. He needed to talk to someone he could trust, a rare commodity in Redemption Bluff. His mind settled on Doc Peterson. No relation to the murdered prospector, a fact that had caused the old physician no end of grief. Doc Eugene Peterson was a cynical, whiskey-soaked veteran of the war, a man who had seen too much of human nature to be fooled by bluster and patriotism. His office was a small clapboard building at the far end of the street. Kais found the doctor cleaning his instruments, the sharp smell of carbolic acid hanging in the air. "Monroe," the doctor grunted without looking up, "come for a plague of locusts or just the usual existential dread?" "Heard you were busy," Kais said, nodding toward the street. The doctor snorted, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot but sharp. busy listening to fools bay at the moon. The whole town's got war fever, thanks to Corian and his pet sheriff. One dead prospector, and suddenly every shadow holds a warrior with a dripping tomahawk. You don't think it was the Apache? Kais asked quietly, closing the door behind him. Doc Peterson put down a scalpel and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a pair of dusty glasses. He pushed one toward Kais. I patched up George Peterson more times than I can count. Bar fights, a mule kick, even a snake bite. He was a stubborn old goat. Most importantly, he was a stubborn old goat who found a silver vein on a piece of land that Bartholomew Corian has been trying to get his hands on for 2 years. George wouldn't sell. The doctor took a long swallow of his whiskey. Then last week, George rides in here, quieter than usual. Says he's got to leave. Says things are getting too hot. He looks scared, Kais. Not of Apaches, of something else. What else? He didn't say, just told me he was taking his wife and girl and heading for California. The next thing I know, Sheriff Brody is forming a posse to avenge his brutal murder at the hands of the savages. The doctor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Funny thing, though, Brody wouldn't let me examine the bodies. Said they were too far gone. Had them buried before sunset the same day they were found. You ever known a lawman to be in that much of a hurry to bury evidence? The pieces were slotting together into a picture of pure, calculated evil. Corian wanted the land. Peterson found silver and refused to sell. Corian's men, Wade, Lyle, and the sheriff himself, went to persuade him. It went wrong. They murdered the family. Nolan's family, who must have been camped nearby or trading with the Petersons, witnessed the whole thing. They were next. The hanging was meant to be the final act, the perfect piece of misdirection. A young Apache girl, lynched with a sign blaming white men, found near the scene of an Apache massacre. It would incite rage on both sides, covering the real crime in a wave of blood and chaos. But there was one detail that still gnawed at Kais. There was another witness, Kais said, his voice barely a whisper. A child, an Apache girl. They left her for dead. They were wrong. Doc Peterson's eyes widened, the cynical facade falling away to reveal a deep alarm. Good God, man. Where is she? At my ranch. She's safe for now. The doctor sank back into his chair, running a hand over his tired face. Kais, you have to get her out of here. Corian is not a man to cross. He's not some petty cattle rustler. He has money, he has men, and he has the law in his pocket. He'll burn you and your ranch to the ground to keep this quiet. I'm not running, Kais said, his voice hard as granite. I'm not leaving my home, and I'm not handing that little girl over to be slaughtered. But I need to know what I'm up against. You're up against a monster who wears a civilized suit, the doctor said grimly. Be careful, Kais. The vultures are circling, and right now you look a whole lot like carrion. Kais finished his whiskey, the liquor doing nothing to warm the chill in his bones. He thanked the doctor, the beaded pouch from Nolan feeling heavier than ever in his pocket. As he loaded his supplies onto his horse, he felt a prickling on the back of his neck. He glanced across the street. Leaning against a post outside the saloon was Lyle, the scar-faced man from the ranch. He wasn't looking at Kais directly, but he was watching. He'd been followed. Or more likely, they'd been waiting for him to show his hand. The trip back to the ranch was a long, tense ride into the setting sun. Kais knew he wasn't just riding home. He was riding into a siege. He had the truth, but in a land run by lies, the truth was a dangerous thing to own. It could get you killed. Or, if you were strong enough to hold on to it, it could become a weapon. Kais Monroe intended to find out which it would be. The ride home was a blur of heightened senses. Every rustle in the sagebrush, every shadow cast by the setting sun, felt like a threat. Kais didn't follow the direct path. He cut through rocky canyons and followed dry riverbeds, adding hours to his journey but making it nearly impossible for anyone to track him in the fading light. He was no longer just a rancher. The instincts of a soldier, long dormant since the war, had resurfaced sharp and clear. He reached the ridge overlooking his property well after midnight. The valley was bathed in moonlight, his small cabin a dark, lonely square in the vastness. There was no light, just as he'd instructed. He watched for a long time, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. Any horses tethered in the cottonwoods? Nothing. The stillness was either a good sign or a very bad one. He approached from the rear, dismounting a quarter-mile away and leading Dust Devil through a thicket of manzanita. He left the horse and his supplies hidden and crept toward the cabin, his Winchester in hand. The silence was absolute. He gave a soft, low whistle, the call of a mourning dove, the signal they had agreed upon. A moment later, he heard a faint scratching from inside. The bar was being lifted. The door creaked open an inch. "Kais!" Nalin's voice was a tiny whisper in the dark. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost made him weak. "It's me." He slipped inside, barring the door behind him. In the gloom he could see her, a small, resilient shadow. She had followed his instructions to the letter. A pot of cold water and a strip of jerky were on the table. She had been prepared to wait. "They watched you," she said, her voice taut. "The man with the cut face. He was in the hills, watching." So they knew. They knew he'd gone to town, and they knew he'd come back. They were letting him stew, letting the fear build. It was a cat and mouse game, and Kais knew the cat would tire of it soon. The next day was spent in feverish preparation. Kais was a man possessed. He retrieved his supplies and then set to work, turning his home into a fortress. He boarded up the back window, leaving only a narrow slit to shoot through. He stacked sacks of flour and grain against the inside of the main door. He filled every bucket and pot with water from the well, knowing they might not be able to get back outside. Nalin worked alongside him, a silent, efficient partner. Her fear had been honed into a sharp, focused energy. She knew the stakes. She showed him things about the land he'd lived on for years but had never truly seen. She pointed to a shallow depression behind the barn, almost invisible unless you knew it was there. A perfect place for cover. She gathered tumbleweeds, piling them at a strategic point downwind from the cabin. For fire, she explained, to make them blind. She was a child of the wilderness, and her knowledge was as valuable as his rifle. A bond forged in shared danger grew between them. They spoke little, but a deep understanding passed between the grizzled, heartbroken man and the orphaned, terrified child. In protecting her, Kais was rediscovering a purpose he thought long buried with his family. In trusting him, Nalin was finding a sliver of hope in a world that had shown her nothing but brutality. The attack came as he knew it would, at dusk on the second day, the time of long shadows and uncertain light. Kai saw them first. 5 riders cresting the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the dying sun. He recognized Wade and Lyle immediately. With them were 3 other men, all carrying rifles, their faces hard and anonymous. Sheriff Brody was not among them, likely staying in town to maintain his alibi. "They're here," Kai said, his voice grim. "Get to your place and remember what I told you." Nalin nodded, her face pale but her eyes steady. She grabbed a small hand axe Kais had given her and slipped down into the cellar beneath the rug, pulling the floorboards shut over her head. Her role was not to fight, but to survive. She was the reason for this fight, and her survival was the only victory that mattered. Kais took his position at the front window, his Winchester resting on the sill. The 5 riders spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the cabin, staying just out of effective rifle range. They were professionals, not a drunken posse. "Monroe!" Wade's voice cut through the evening air. "We know she's in there. Bartholomew Corian is a reasonable man. He just wants what belongs to him. Send the girl out, and you can walk away. Nobody has to get hurt." The lie was so blatant it was almost laughable. Kais rested his cheek against the cool wood of his rifle stock. He said nothing. His silence was his answer. "Have it your way," Wade yelled. The first shot shattered the window next to Kais's head, spraying glass and splinters into the room. The siege had begun. The next hour was a cacophony of gunfire, splintering wood, and shouted curses. They fired methodically, trying to punch holes in his defenses, trying to draw his fire so they could pinpoint his position. Kais was patient. He was a good shot, but he was outnumbered 5-1. Every bullet had to count. He waited, letting them get overconfident, letting them creep closer. One of the men, bolder than the rest, made a dash for the barn. Kais tracked him in his sights, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. The man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. One down. The others answered with a furious volley of fire that ripped through the cabin walls, chewing up the furniture and kicking up dust. Kais moved, crawling from the window to a firing slit he'd made in the side wall. They expected him to stay put. He fired again, this time at Lyle, who was taking cover behind the water trough. The bullet ricocheted off the metal with a loud clang, forcing Lyle to duck back. The fight settled into a grim rhythm. They would advance, firing, and he would push them back with a well-aimed shot. The sun set completely, plunging the valley into darkness. The firing became more sporadic, more probing. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. Suddenly, a new sound reached him, a crackling, and a new light. An orange glow began to build from the direction of his barn. "He's trying to burn you out, Monroe," Wade shouted. "Last chance." Rage, pure and hot, surged through Kai's. His barn, his hay, his tools, everything he had built. They were trying to erase him from the land. He had to do something, or the fire would spread to the cabin itself. This was the moment Nolan had prepared for. Before they could react, a second fire erupted, far to the west of the cabin. The pile of tumbleweeds she had gathered, ignited by a single well-thrown ember she must have crept out to place, went up in a whoosh of flame and thick, acrid smoke. The wind, just as she'd predicted, carried the smoke directly towards the attackers' position, shrouding them in a blinding, choking cloud. It was the chance he needed. Under the cover of the smoke and confusion, Kai slipped out the back of the cabin. He moved low and fast, a ghost in the darkness, circling around toward the barn. He could hear them coughing and cursing in the smoke. One of them, distracted, was silhouetted against the flames of the burning barn. It was the man he'd shot in the leg, trying to crawl to safety. Another of Corian's men was helping him. Kais raised his rifle. He could end two of them right now. But something stopped him. He wasn't a murderer. He was a man defending his home. He fired into the dirt at their feet. "Get out of here!" he roared, his voice like a thunderclap in the chaos. "Take your wounded man and ride out." The gunman, startled, fired blindly into the smoke before grabbing his injured comrade and dragging him back towards the horses. The smoke from Nolan's fire began to thin. Wade and Lyle, their eyes streaming, finally saw him. "There he is!" Lyle bellowed, raising his rifle. But they had forgotten the fifth man. As Lyle took aim at Kais, a shot rang out from a different direction, from the rocky depression behind the barn that Nolan had pointed out. The fifth gunman, who had circled around to flank the cabin, had a clear shot at Kais's exposed back. Time seemed to slow down. Kais heard the shot, saw the muzzle flash, and knew he couldn't turn in time. He braced for the impact, a cold finality washing over him. But the bullet never came. Instead, he heard a sickening thud and a grunt of surprise. The flanking gunman staggered forward and fell face first into the dirt, the handle of a small hand axe protruding from his back. Kai stared in disbelief. From behind a rock, Nalina emerged, her face a mask of fierce determination. She had not stayed hidden. She had seen the flanker, armed herself with the only weapons she had, and saved his life. The balance had shifted. Two men were wounded or fleeing. One was dead. It was now 2 against 2. Kais and a child against Wade and Lyle. Wade, seeing his plan disintegrating, let out a roar of fury. "You stubborn old fool, you're dead!" He and Lyle charged, firing as they came, abandoning tactics for a final desperate rush. Kais dropped to one knee, raising his Winchester. This was it, the end of the line. The lonely rancher and the Apache girl against the tide. He took aim at Wade's chest, the fate of his world narrowing to the space between his rifle's front and rear sights. And that's when the night exploded. Kai squeezed the trigger, his Winchester roaring in answer to the charge. But Wade stumbled, not from Kais's bullet, but from surprise. Out of the darkness, from the direction of the Chiricahua Mountains, a sound arose that froze the blood of every white man in the valley. The high, piercing cry of an Apache war party. It wasn't a cry of random aggression. It was a focused, vengeful sound. From the shadows of the hills and arroyos, figures emerged. At least a dozen Apache warriors, their faces painted for battle, moving with a silent, deadly grace that made Corian's hired guns look like clumsy cattle. They were not there by chance. Leading them was a tall, stern-faced man with the unmistakable air of a leader. His eyes scanned the chaotic scene, the burning barn, the dead gunman, Kai's on one knee, Nalan standing protectively behind him, and then his eyes locked onto Nalan herself. "Nalan!" he cried, his voice filled with a desperate relief. "Kyle!" she answered. And for the first time since Kais had found her, she ran. She ran not in fear, but towards the warrior, her uncle. They had not been raiding. They had been tracking, searching for their lost child. Their hunt had led them directly to this moonlit battlefield. Wade and Lyle froze, their desperate charge forgotten. They were trapped. Behind them, a rancher with a rifle and a child who had just killed one of their own. In front of them, a dozen enraged Apache warriors whose kin they had tried to murder. The color drained from their faces. The hunters had become the prey. Kyle, the Apache leader, strode forward, his warriors fanning out to surround the two gunmen. He ignored them for a moment, kneeling to embrace Nalan, speaking to her in their native tongue in low, urgent tones. She answered him, her words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and fear, but also of strength. She pointed a trembling finger, not at Kais, but directly at Wade and Lyle. Then she pointed to the dead man with the axe in his back. And then she looked at Kais, pointed to him, and placed a hand over her own heart. The meaning was unmistakable. Kyle's gaze shifted to Kai's, his expression unreadable. He had seen a white man armed in the middle of a firefight with his niece present, but he had also just heard Nalan's story. He rose and walked towards Kai's, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife, not his rifle. Kai stood his ground, lowering his Winchester but not letting it go. This was the moment of truth. "You are the man who cut her from the tree," Kyle said, his English heavily accented but clear. It wasn't a question. "I am," Kai said. "You gave her shelter," Kyle continued, his eyes searching Kais's face. "You fought for her." "I did." Kyle looked at the dead gunman, then back at Kai's. "The enemies of my niece are my enemies, but a white man's fight is not always my fight. Why?" It was the most important question of Kais's life. He could have talked about honor, about decency. Instead, he told the simple truth. "Because I lost a child once. I couldn't lose another." The words struck a chord deeper than race or language. Kyle's hard expression softened for a fraction of a second. He gave a single, sharp nod. The unspoken truce was sealed. He then turned his full, terrifying attention to Wade and Lyle, who were now disarmed and held by the warriors. "The girl says you work for a man named Corian," Kyle said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She says you and a man with a star killed her family and the family of the prospector. You did this to her?" He gestured toward Nalan's neck, where the rope burn was still a livid scar. Wade, ever the talker, tried to bluster his way out. "It's a lie. She's a savage. We were. We were sent by the law to investigate the Peterson massacre." Lyle, his bravado gone, was shaking. "We was just following orders." "Just orders." Kyle smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "The law of a white man's town does not reach into these mountains. Here, there is a different law." He turned to his warriors and issued a series of sharp commands in Apache. They did not kill Wade and Lyle. The justice of the Apache was more patient than that. They bound them securely and began to lead them away into the dark, jagged mountains from which they had come. Wade screamed, pleaded, and cursed, but his voice was swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the desert. They were being taken to face a justice that Bart Corian's money could not buy them out of. It was a fate worse than a quick bullet. As the war party prepared to leave, Kyle approached Kayers one last time. Nalan stood by his side, her hand tucked securely in his. "The man Corian," Kyle said, "and the man with the star. They will not rest. They will say we attacked you. They will say we have taken this girl. They will use this to bring a bigger war." "I know," Kai said, "but now they have no one to back their story, and I have the truth." Kyle nodded. "Nalan will come with us. She will be safe with her people. She will tell our elders what she saw. The truth will be known among the Apache." He paused, looking at the bond between the grieving rancher and the child. "You have done a brave thing, Kais Monroe. The Chiricahua do not forget a debt nor an injury. If Corian comes for you, he will find that your ranch has more guardians than he knows. It was time for Nellen to go. She turned to Kais, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't say anything. She simply reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a single, perfect eagle feather, which she pressed into his hand. Then she threw her arms around his waist and hugged him tightly, a gesture of pure, unvarnished love and gratitude. Kais's own eyes burned. He knelt and hugged her back, his rough hand gently stroking her hair. "Be safe, Nalin," he whispered. He watched them melt back into the darkness, Nalin walking proudly beside her uncle, a survivor, going home. The war cries were replaced by the quiet chirping of crickets and the crackle of his burning barn. He was alone again, but not empty. The silence of his cabin was no longer the silence of grief, but the quiet of purpose. The next day, Kais rode to Redemption Bluff. He didn't sneak in. He rode straight down the main street, the eagle feather tucked into his hatband. He walked into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was there, along with Bartholomew Corian himself, a portly, well-dressed man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the predatory glint in his eyes. They were planning their next move. They stopped talking when he entered. "Monroe," Brody said, his hand moving instinctively towards his gun. "We heard there was a raid at your place. The Apaches." "There was no raid," Kai said, his voice ringing with authority. He threw the fancy stitched boot of the dead gunman onto Brody's desk. "This belonged to one of your deputies, Sheriff. Or one of your hired men, Corian." Corian's face went pale. Brody stared at the boot as if it were a coiled snake. "I don't know who you think you are," Corian began, his voice blustering. "I'm the man who found the girl you tried to murder." Kais cut him off, his gaze like iron. "The witness to you killing the Petersons. Your men, Wade and Lyle, they told the Apache everything before they were taken. The girl Nalin is back with her people. They know the truth, and now so do I. And soon this whole town will." He turned and walked out, leaving the two men in a stunned, guilty silence. The story would spread. Without his hired guns to enforce his lies, Corian's power would crumble under the weight of the truth. His empire was built on fear, and Kais had just shown everyone that he was not afraid. Kais Monroe returned to his ranch. He rebuilt his barn stronger this time. The land was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a man at peace, a man who had faced down his ghosts and the evils of others and had not backed down. He was no longer lonely. He had a family in the mountains, a purpose in his heart, and an eagle feather in his hat to remind him that even in the most brutal of lands, courage could still forge the most unlikely of bonds. And so Kais Monroe's story became a quiet legend in the San Simon Valley, a testament to the fact that true strength isn't found in the power you wield over others, but in the protection you offer to the vulnerable. It's a story about how one man's stand, one act of courage, can unravel a web of lies and expose the darkness hiding behind a badge or a bank account. It reminds us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's forged in fire, in shared danger, and in the simple human refusal to look away. The Wild West was a land of harsh justice, but as Kais and Nalin proved, it was also a place where the most profound acts of grace could bloom in the dust. If this story of grit, survival, and unlikely redemption resonated with you, please help keep these legends of the West alive. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a real story of the frontier, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales of the brave, the bold, and the beautifully human souls who shape the American West.